Jason killed Jay. He had also heard her scream. The reason he hadn't reported this to the captain was due to the haunting stories he'd heard, fearing he might become Jason's next victim. After parting with her uncle, Rennie headed to the restroom to calm her nerves, but as she was washing up, something strange began to happen. The once clear faucet water suddenly turned crimson, and as Rennie looked up in confusion, a ghostly hand shot out from the mirror, gripping her throat tightly. The hand belonged to a twisted-looking young boy. Using all her strength, Rennie managed to break free from his grasp, but to her shock, the little boy suddenly asked her for help. When everything returned to normal, Rennie glanced back at the mirror, only to find no trace of the ghostly vision. Because of her childhood near-drowning incident, Rennie assumed it was all just a hallucination brought on by her own fears, but she was unaware that a terrifying threat had boarded the ship along with her. Meanwhile, Charles, furious at Tamara for mocking Rennie, decided to confront her in her cabin. He warned that if she didn't produce her report, he would report her to the school and her parents. However, Tamara was unfazed. She calmly slipped off her bathrobe, attempting to seduce Charles into a deal. Although Charles protested and tried to leave, Tamara had anticipated his reaction and had arranged for Wayne, who had a camera, to record footage that could be used to blackmail him. Fuming, Charles stormed out of the room, followed shortly by Wayne, whom Tamara promptly kicked out as well. But soon after, the door creaked open again, and this time, it was Jason. Hearing the noise, Tamara peeked through the door crack and saw a figure wearing a hockey mask. While she wondered if this was some oddball passenger, Jason's massive hand smashed through the door, grabbing her by the hair. He entered the room, punched the mirror above the sink, and, taking a shard of broken glass, killed the scheming Tamara. No one heard her scream, as a violent storm outside masked all sounds with thunderous crashes. The worsening weather worried the captain, who immediately began adjusting the ship's speed with his first mate. Little did they know that Jason's next targets were them. Feeling his age, the captain asked his first mate to take over while he went to rest for a bit. The first mate, focused on steering, didn't notice anything amiss behind him. Jason approached silently with a harpoon and stabbed him from behind, repeatedly, until the first mate lay lifeless. When the captain returned and found his first mate's body, he knelt down to inspect it, only for Jason to appear and slash his throat with a machete. Shortly after, Sean brought Rennie to the bridge, planning to ask his father to turn the ship back, only to discover his father's corpse. Realizing the killer was still on board, Sean fought through his grief and quickly used the intercom to summon everyone to the bridge. Then he went to the radio to contact the Coast Guard for help. But just as someone answered, Jason severed the radio line outside, cutting off their connection to the Coast Guard. Hearing the announcement, Charles and the others hurried to the bridge. The last to arrive was the janitor, who repeated his ominous warnings about the dangers lurking on board. Charles, enraged by his cryptic words, grabbed a machete and threatened to strike the janitor. Sensing the danger, the janitor left with one final warning before disappearing into the ship. Charles stubbornly refused to believe that the killer could be the resurrected Jason, insisting that the murderer had to be someone else, possibly even the janitor, although he had no evidence to back this up. At that moment, Julius spoke up, pointing out that regardless of who the killer was, a murder had indeed occurred, and their top priority should be gathering everyone and finding a way to stop the killer. He proposed tracking down and killing the killer before they could be found, but Charles shot down his idea, perhaps out of his desire to maintain control or a genuine concern for the students' safety. He demanded that everyone follow his orders. However, Julius and some of the other recent graduates were unwilling to listen to ignoring Charles's objections. Julius rallied his friends to start a search for Jason. The next unfortunate victim was about to be Eva. After hearing the announcement, Eva noticed that Tamara was nowhere to be found, so she went to her cabin to look for her. To her horror, she discovered Tamara's cold, lifeless body in the bathroom. Panicked, Eva bolted from the room, but as soon as she turned into the hallway, she ran straight into Jason, realizing she might meet the same fate as Tamara. Eva snapped out of her shock and started running for her life, screaming for help. Unfortunately, no one responded. Desperate, she ducked into the dance hall, where loud music and flashing lights filled the space. Jason was right behind her. Eva tried to escape through another door, but luck wasn't on her side. All the exits were locked. Growing impatient, Jason appeared behind her, grabbed her by the throat, and lifted her into the air, choking the life out of her as she hung in the air, her legs dangling until she stopped moving. Elsewhere on the ship, Julius and his friends prepared to ambush Jason, who they assumed was hiding somewhere in the shadows. Julius handed out weapons to his friends, whatever they could find that could deal some damage, though he confidently chose to go in barefisted, trusting his boxing skills to take down Jason. However, after a moment's hesitation, he also picked up a gun from the floor. Yet, despite their plans, the group made a serious mistake. They decided to split up, playing right into Jason's hands, as he was known for picking off his targets one by one. The first to fall victim was Wayne. Even in this life-or-death situation, Wayne couldn't abandon his dream of filmmaking and carried his camera wherever he went. As he searched the ship's lower engine room for Jason, a sudden blast of steam shot out of a pipe, knocking his glasses off. Now unable to see clearly, Wayne spotted a shadowy figure up ahead. Unable to tell friend from foe and acting out of fear, Wayne pulled the trigger without hesitation. As he approached the figure, he realized with horror that he had accidentally shot a fellow student. Before he could even process what he'd done, he saw a pair of large boots through his camera lens. It was Jason. Jason swatted the camera aside with a single blow. Wayne, though furious, knew survival was his priority. He spun around and started running, but he tripped after only a few steps, stumbling over JJ's corpse. That brief moment of shock gave Jason enough time to catch up. Perhaps inspired by his own resurrection through electrocution, Jason grabbed Wayne and threw him onto the generator to see how a living person would react to high-voltage shock. But unlike Jason, Wayne was no match for the electricity, and his body finally went still under the intense current. Soon, the entire engine room burst into flames, and Jason, satisfied, hit the alarm. Back on the bridge, Sean's efforts had finally gotten the ship back on course, but just as he breathed a sigh of relief, the alarm blared over the ship's intercom. Seeing this, Charles pulled out a flare gun. Looking ready for action, Colleen thought he intended to signal for help and reminded him that the bad weather would likely make any signal difficult to spot. However, Charles's plan was to hunt down the killer and take him out with the flare gun. Convinced that whoever triggered the fire alarm was the murderer, Charles suspected someone was deliberately inciting panic on the ship. Yet he remained fixated on the janitor as the killer, believing his odd behavior was proof enough. Meanwhile, out on the deck, another student wearing a purple jacket was searching for Jason with an axe in hand. Before he could locate Jason, though, Jason appeared right behind him. The student, emboldened by his weapon, chose to attack rather than flee. But Jason, far stronger, easily seized the axe and threw it aside. Now weaponless and terrified, the student abandoned his bravado and scrambled up to the lookout platform, hoping it would be safe. But his plan failed, as Jason followed him up without hesitation. Reaching the top, Jason grabbed the student and hurled him down from the lookout. When Julius heard the commotion and rushed over, he was met with the horrifying sight of his friend impaled on a metal pole. Before he could react, Jason appeared behind him and threw him overboard into the sea. With this, the search team Julius had organized was completely wiped out. After the murders were discovered, Rennie's uncle Charles locked her in her cabin for her own safety. As she sat there, bored and anxious, she suddenly turned to see that eerie young boy from before, once again appearing in her room. Terrified, Rennie backed away, only to have Jason suddenly appear behind her. He smashed his head through the window, reaching in and grabbing her by the throat. In desperation, Rennie groped around and grabbed a pen from the table, stabbing it directly into Jason's eye. With a howl of pain, Jason released her, and as if by magic, the ghostly boy disappeared. Shaken to her core, Rennie was about to leave the room when Sean burst in. Finding comfort in Sean's presence, Rennie clung to him, but their relief was short-lived. As the lights began to flicker, a massive explosion in the engine room had ignited a fire, causing a power failure that plunged the entire ship into darkness. This chaotic environment was just what Jason thrived in. Elsewhere, Charles, still searching for the killer, held his flare gun as he crept into the ship's kitchen. Unbeknownst to him, a figure was quietly approaching from behind. Suddenly, the janitor, the same man who had warned them earlier, emerged from the shadows. Fortunately, neither made any sudden moves. Meanwhile, Seawater started flooding the lower decks due to the explosion in the engine room. If they didn't find a way off the ship soon, everyone would be doomed. As Sean led Rennie through the halls, they ran into Charles coming out of the kitchen. Charles blamed Sean and Colleen for putting Rennie in danger, but at this point, there was no time to argue. Just then, Miss Colleen appeared, announcing that she had lowered the lifeboat and that they could escape if they made it to the deck. As the four of them reached the deck, they encountered the janitor staggering toward them. Charles raised his flare gun, preparing to shoot, but before he could act, the janitor collapsed, revealing a hatchet buried in his back. With the janitor's death, Charles's theory was completely disproven. Now, even he had to accept that Jason had somehow come back to life. The four of them climbed down a rope ladder into the lifeboat. As the last one down, Sean, by the flash of lightning,